of course, this has been a program that has been resting on its offense for some fans. It seems like for the entire history of the program, because they don't know anything different than having elite quarterback play and wide receivers, and then just hoping the defense makes enough stops or one more than the opponent's defense or make some kind of turnover to make things happen, but not having a dominant defense for sure, but not even having a competent defense at times. Three guys come to mind for me in a defensive effort last year that was good, that could be even better this year. Would be, if you didn't watch this defense play and you just looked at a stats sheet, you would see that Billy Bowman, Danny Stutzman just had all sorts of crazy numbers in the box score. And not surprisingly, they're showing up on a ton of all SEC teams, even all America teams. And then the other guy, more from a playmaking standpoint and what the potential could be, would be Peyton Bowen. Of course, his recruitment was much ballyhooed, and he finally chose Oklahoma. And right out of the gate, spring game, early games in the season showed that he's a tremendous athlete. So right out of the gate, those are the three guys that come to mind. But certainly, Jason, you can start this discussion wherever you'd like.
Yeah, Mark, I think it's interesting, kind of on the opening that you had, just related to where this defense has been historically over the last 15, 20 years. It's really just been a situation where, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It was, a real reason why Oklahoma probably doesn't have another national championship here over the last 10 years. And as you'd mentioned, even with Brent Venables coming aboard, year one was not great. They started off, for the first 4 or 5 games pretty good, and then they turned into be one of the worst, unfortunately, one of the worst defenses in the country over the last 5 or 6 games, or specifically like the Big 12 season in and of itself. As you mentioned, last year was an improvement, but still probably not where they need to be. Right, there was some games down the stretch where it wasn't horrible by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a game. Uh, the final game of the regular season against TCU, where they gave up a ton of points. I want to say it was like 42 or 45 to TCU, and that was the most points that TCU scored all year. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a defense that has been much improved. I think, Mark, to your point about the individuals that you mentioned, I think this is probably the first time, I would say, in 20 years where Oklahoma probably has a first round draft pick. We'll see how the season goes, but I think on paper they have a first round draft pick probably at every level of the defense, and specifically that you'd mentioned, Billy Bowman and Danny Stutzman. Those are two guys that Oklahoma was very concerned that they wouldn't be part of this team this year, just in terms of an early entrance into the draft. So much so, Danny Stutzman actually declared, didn't hire an agent, then decided to come back, which was a big get for Oklahoma. I mean, those things are almost like getting a 4 or 5 star recruit, right? A guy that you maybe anticipate was leaving, and then Billy Bowman as well. He was a guy that never entered, but I think there was some thoughts that he probably would enter. Then he decided to come back for his senior season. So yeah, those two guys, and you would expect just the natural jump from true freshman year to sophomore year for Peyton Bowen. He did a really good job while he was in there. Didn't get, wasn't a starter for a good majority of the year. Didn't get a lot of snaps, but the snaps that he got were very quality. You'd mentioned played really well in those games where he had an opportunity, whether it was the spring game or just in the season in and of itself. So yeah, those are a few guys that certainly will be playmakers. And Oklahoma's had a situation where they've had to rebuild the defensive line to a certain degree, right? And so I think the addition of Dominique Williams from TCU is going to be a big time addition for Oklahoma in the middle of that defensive line. So yeah, I think you've got a lot of, if you're an Oklahoma fan, there's a lot of reasons to be happy, to be optimistic, because they've seen a natural progression over the last couple of years, under Brent Venables, and now defensive coordinator Zach Alley coming over from Jacksonville State. You think, you hope that this Oklahoma defense can make that next step and continue to improve as they have over the last couple of years.
Talking Sooners football with all of you here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by. Leave those comments and questions. We will get to them here at the Voice of College Football. I've been scanning on my phone looking for a number of comments and questions that came into the channel this week to see if there's anything there of interest as we look at the defense. So you went up front first and foremost on the defense, and it all starts in football, maybe not as much as it did 50 years ago, but still starts in the trenches and establishing the point of attack or crashing the point of attack on defense, but maybe not so much in the Big 12 as is going to be dependent on this defensive front in the SEC to be stout. Do the guys coming off the bus look like an SEC defensive line up front?
So I think that's interesting that you mentioned that. I saw something today, and I hadn't really put two and two together in terms of what that weight looks like. But in 2021, from a defensive line perspective, Oklahoma only had one player, one, that was over 295 pounds. And I think part of that was where that roster was at with Lincoln Riley, with Alex Grinch, and the Speed D moniker that he had brought to Norman in terms of having quicker, more elusive defensive linemen. You take that forward to 2024, Oklahoma has 10 of those guys, right? So you go from that. So I think, to your question, Mark, I think, yeah, on paper this looks more like an SEC defensive line, that you would expect, particularly in the two guys that, I mean, you've Mark, I think you've probably got three guys that they feel good about in the middle. Mentioned Dominique Williams coming over from TCU, and really just wasn't in a position where he could be as disruptive for TCU as probably they would have liked and you would have anticipated. But he was double, triple teamed pretty much on a consistent basis last year at TCU. So I think he's a guy that Oklahoma got post spring that they were super, super excited about getting, and I think he's going to be a guy that I think they believe, at least from an athletic perspective, and what he's been able to do thus far in the college, at TCU, as a guy that can play at the next level. And then the other guy that you have is Dejon Terry, the Tennessee transfer that played a lot last year. So those are two guys. Those are two plus 300 plus guys in the middle of that defensive line. And then I think the other guy to keep, to kind of keep your eye on, just in terms of a defensive tackle, is Grayson Halton. He's a guy he was really, really ballyhooed coming in terms of a recruit. Has had injuries or just hasn't been able to make his way on the field. Did a really good job late last year. Had a really good spring. Has had a really good summer from everything that I've heard. So he's a guy that they anticipate being in that mix, at that, whatever you want to call nose guard, defensive tackle type positions inside.
I was curious to see, Jason, not to run away from you, but I was tracking down the Phil Steele magazine. It's always exhaustive just to see what he has to say about these position groups. So defensive line, he mentions that Oklahoma loses the defensive end, Bothroyd, who had 13 starts.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got defensive tackle Isaiah Coe, who is also missing, defensive tackle Jacob Lacey, and D tackle Jonah Laulu. Then you got 13 Big 12 defensive lineman Downs, 4.5 sacks. Ethan Downs returns, as does Dejan Terry, Trace Ford. They add first team MAC defensive end Caden Woolard, 12 starts, 9.5 sacks, fourth team Big 12 defensive tackle, as you mentioned, Dominic Williams, who for a couple of weeks there was the prize of the transfer portal.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was talking about him. Was the eighth rated player at his position coming out of high school. Linebackers. He says in 2022, Danny Stutzman led the team with 126 tackles. OU still allowed 496 yards per game and 36 points per game versus Big 12 foes. Last year, they lost their number 2 and 3 tacklers. They added Indiana transfer Dason McCullough. Despite losing 2 starters, head coach Brent Venables felt that this unit was in better overall shape and the defense did improve. This year, the Sooners returned the top 6 linebackers and the top 5 tacklers and are the best linebacking core of the Venables era. And, wow, he has this linebacking core ranked as it appears. I might have missed this. He's got them pretty highly ranked. Let's see, linebackers, the number 2 linebacking unit in the country.
That's interesting. I mean, I think when you look at this linebacker core coming into 2024, Mark, it is a group that is probably one of the strengths of the team. I think defensively specifically, I think that the linebacker group as well as the safety group is a group that's probably the strongest. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Danny Stutzman is a guy that, as I mentioned before, had a great year last year, as you mentioned, 126 tackles. He's a guy that's probably an NFL guy, right? That's still playing college, but has the opportunity to get a little bit better. Now I think he's your starter at the mic. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that. Obviously, then you look at the will. Kip Lewis is a guy that came on strong late last year, who is very instinctual. I think he probably wasn't necessarily where they would love him to be in terms of a weight perspective, but he's worked on that in the summer. So expect that to be a big improvement. And then Jaron Kanik is another guy that's going to battle for that, could battle for that will position. Played a little bit, he was a starter there last year, really kind of ended up getting unseated just a little bit with Kip Lewis and his progressiveness, progression, I should say, from that side of things. And then there's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of athleticism in that group, and yeah, exciting to see. Now, number 2 in the country. I mean, that's lofty. Obviously, I mean, when you said number 2, I was kind of thinking SEC, but overall in the country, yeah, that'll be interesting to see how that um, how that works from a linebacker core, because yeah, they've got a lot of guys that have played in the past, but making sure that that's shored up that full group, and it's not really just Danny Stutzman and and the others, right? So
Yeah, that's why when I read that in the Oklahoma summary, I verified it by
hmm.
frantically finding it on the national rankings just to make sure I didn't read that incorrectly. But Bill Steele at linebacker, Iowa 1, Oklahoma 2, Georgia 3, Texas 4, Oklahoma State 5. There it is.
So I would say, Mark, if Oklahoma lives up to that top 5 linebacker core billing, then certainly that leads you to believe that Oklahoma's going to have a really good year defensively, because they feel good about where they're at on the back end. Like as I mentioned, particularly at safety, there might be a couple of questions at cornerback from a depth perspective, but this should be good on the back half. And I think there's just probably, Mark, a lot of, and concern is not the right word, just looking for someone to step up at that edge position. You'd mentioned just from a defensive line, while you're looking at that, you've mentioned Ethan Downs. Venables said Ethan Downs is the only guy that coming into the season, he's a starter. The rest of them are up for grabs. And you'd mentioned a lot of the guys that Oklahoma has had to replace, and so it is having to replace. So it's a little bit similar to the situation that Oklahoma has on the offensive line. in terms of having to replace a lot of guys. They've got a lot of good kids there, but are they able to? How are they able to play? You mentioned Caden Woolard coming over. He's a guy at the defensive end position, at the edge position that has some promise. But I would say athletically, PJ Adebaware, he's the best. He's the best one that they have from an athletic perspective. He looks the part. He looks like an when you mention like coming off the bus, he looks like an NFL player. But he's only a sophomore. He's got the body. Does he is he able to make that big jump? Right. I mean, I think the thought was he probably would make a pretty big jump from the end of the season to the spring. Didn't really show itself, on the field, but some kids it takes a little bit longer for that, that proverbial light bulb to turn on. So is he a guy that's going to be able to be a really good player for them on the edge, along with Ethan Downs and Caden Woolard? So you'll see. I mean, you got Trace Ford that was there last year from Oklahoma State, made some nice plays, but he's not a necessarily like a game changer on that side of the ball. So I think that's probably, I would say, the biggest question mark. Not necessarily in the middle, but more from an edge perspective on what they're able to do.
All right. Looking at defensive back, and again, keeping in mind, this is just the Phil Steele take, just to give another perspective. 21st rated defensive line, number 2 rated linebacking core. He says about the DBs, in 2022, OU made a large jump in pass defensive rankings to number 45, 20 touchdowns, 17 picks, which is a really good ratio against quarterback play, 20 touchdowns, 17 picks. That led the Big 12 in interceptions, even though they were last in the Big 12 in yards given up per game in 22. In 2023, they lost 2 starters and 5 of their top 7 cornerbacks. They added Reggie Pearson from Texas Tech. The Sooners rose all the way to number 8 in the pass defensive rankings. And these are not the national pass defense rankings. These are Phil Steele's compilation. 18 touchdowns, 20 picks. That's an excellent ratio when you're intercepting more passes than giving up touchdowns. Billy Bowman had the huge 100-yard interception return against BYU, one of 3 pick sixes. This year they lose safety Key Lawrence and safety Reggie Pearson, but return 3 starters and add San Diego State starter Des Malone. They are, listen to this, number 2 at linebacker. The defensive back rankings nationally, Ohio State number 1, Oklahoma number 2.
It's such an odd thing to think about, right? When we went last week, when you were talking about the offensive rankings, and Oklahoma was down. I mean, in a couple of those in the 40s, right? And then you've got linebacker at number 2, and then defensive, the secondary at number 2 as well. So, I think I think it lines up when you look at the strength of the defense. I think absolutely the linebacking core and the back end, the back 7 is going to be. It looks to be the strength of this defense. You'd mentioned Des Malone coming over from San Diego State, started the last 23 games at San Diego State. He's a plug and play guy that they feel good about. For Oklahoma, you got Gentry Williams, who was, unfortunately, he was banged up quite a bit when he was healthy. He was very, very good, very aggressive. Has got really great instincts. You saw him early on against Texas really kind of set the tone for Oklahoma defensively, and getting that interception early on in that game. Was out a little bit in that game in Oklahoma. You saw a little bit of that in terms of how they played the rest of the way defensively, particularly the back half of that game. And then you got Woody Washington, as a guy you'd mentioned there as well. He's a guy that, a 6-year guy for Oklahoma, has made 36 starts in his career. I think that they may look at opportunities to move him around. He may be a guy that ends up being their nickelback if they feel good about Des Malone and Gentry Williams there at the cornerback position. And they've got a lot of guys that they feel good from a depth perspective at: Jacoby Johnson, Makari Vickers, Kanai Walker. Those are guys that have played. I mean, Kenai Walker has the most experience over the last couple of years, but Makari Vickers got a little bit of time. Jacoby Johnson got some time in special teams, and so those were the guys that that you look at. But then when you look at the safeties as well, you've got Billy Bowman and you've got Peyton Bowen probably in some kind of a starting position. Robert Spears Jennings stepped up and played a lot, a really heavy hitter, a big enforcer on the back end as well. Then they've got a couple of freshmen that may have the ability to help a little bit, at least from a depth perspective early on. Specifically, I think Reggie Powers is a guy that I've heard a lot of good things about in terms of he's a guy that could be ready to help them early on. And so, yeah, I don't know that I would go so far to say I mean, you could make an argument, but number two is tough to live up to. But again, how we've talked, over the last few weeks, Mark, about where this team could get to from a win-loss perspective. If you've got, and I'm not even going to say number two, if you've got top five in the country linebacker core and secondary, this is a team that, I mean, if you're that good in the back level, then it maybe masks some of your, if you've got some struggles at the edge position. Um, so I think overall, the not specifically just the defense, Mark, but I think overall, I think Oklahoma likes the talent that they have. They like the guys that they have here now. Obviously, on the field is a little bit different, and some of the teams that they haven't played, obviously in the SEC, and just kind of getting used to that grind. But I think they like what they have. The pieces that they have, I think they would like probably to the point that we've been talking about. I think they would like maybe they really need to have someone step up from that edge position. But yeah, it's just a matter of going out and doing it on the field because this has been a team. It's a little bit of a, I mean, although they've improved each year, it's a little bit of a kind of a sign that they've started strong both the last 2 years, and they've kind of faltered a bit down the stretch in some of these in some of these games later in the season. So with this being more of a grind that we've talked about, that's going to be critically important to make sure that they have good depth where they're in a position where they'll be able to compete at a high level even when they've got some of these backup guys in and as they finish that last portion of the season.